You're now tuned in to the Better Brain Podcast with your hosts, Miles Sorrell and Dr. Michael Lewis. Dive deep into the world of brain health, the latest in neurobiology, natural health, and nutrition. Stay up to date with groundbreaking research and discover the power of natural products and lifestyle choices. Stay curious and stay informed, because when it comes to your brain, knowledge is power.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Better Brain Podcast, where we discuss the latest research in neuroscience and nutrition. My name is Miles, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Michael Lewis. How's it going today?
It's going great, Miles. That's always look forward to doing these with you, and can't wait to do more.
Likewise, and we have a really interesting topic to discuss today. You sent me over a pretty interesting review article, a perspective discussing the gut-brain axis in traumatic brain injury. So we've already discussed in a recent episode traumatic brain injury. You're an expert in traumatic brain injury, so I have a lot of questions for you on this in particular. And the gut-brain axis is a really hot topic, and it centers around the idea that in the gut microbiome, in which we have trillions of bacteria living within our gut, but also in our skin and other parts of our body, contribute to our health in profound ways. Can you summarize some of the latest research on the microbiome?
Well, the microbiome is sort of an offshoot of our genome. So once we sequenced the genome, which was a lot faster than they ever imagined when they were beginning. What was that, back in the 90s? It was a while ago. And then it was sort of like, let's start to tackle the microbiome. And they came to quickly realize they're way over their heads, because you're talking about trillions of cells, not just somebody's DNA. And so it very quickly became obvious that it's one of the most complicated things. The fact that we literally have trillions of foreigners living inside our bodies. They're all one cell size, but what's become really interesting is just how powerful that microbiome is, and some people often refer to it as our second brain, and
right.
that it produces everything from neurotransmitters to alterations in our immune system, to just so many different things. Probably we're just scratching the surface. Just like our understanding of the brain, our understanding of the microbiome, I think we're just in the infant, not even crawling stage yet.
Right. I've heard studies indicating that the amount of bacteria that our body is host to ranges anywhere between as many cells, as many eukaryotic human cells as we have in our body, to perhaps as much as 10 times that number. So we're host to all of these organisms. And of course, there'd be some relationship between our host's defenses and these bacteria. Broadly speaking, it seems like the research indicates that if we have a really diverse microbiome, there's a lot of different types of species, that it's a healthy microbiome, but that, of course, various lifestyle or dietary or pharmaceutical interventions can decrease the diversity of that microbiome. Antibiotics can limit some of the healthful bacteria that grow in our gut. Cheeseburgers and omega-6 rich foods can also do the same thing, but also being stressed out.
Yeah.
And in turn, the quality of the gut microbiome, what is growing in our intestines, is going to be impacting our stress levels, is going to be impacting our metabolism, our general homeostasis. At least that's what the latest research suggests.
No, absolutely. And, places like, this is not just, some offshoot somewhere. We're talking about places like Johns Hopkins and Harvard Medical School and the Mayo Clinic, looking at even to the point of doing fecal transplants in people who have chronic diseases, and taking literally fecal material from healthy people, kind of clean out the bad from the in the person that's struggling, and literally implant somebody else's fecal material into the rectum and having profound changes in their health status by introducing healthy, good bacteria to replace the bad stuff that's going on in somebody that's struggling with whatever type of illness it might be.
Right. I mean, this is sort of the newest research in organ transplantation. It's the microbiome transplantation to correct various chronic and lifestyle associated diseases. I mean, I've seen studies on the association between the gut microbiome and everything from eczema to marital distress.
Yeah.
So it's really broad and it's really fascinating. And a lot of the interest comes from the specific notion of the bidirectional communication between our nervous system and our gut microbiome, the so-called gut-brain connection. And in this paper that we're reviewing today, that we'll put in the show notes, there's this one sentence that I think summarizes it perfectly. The bidirectional nature of the gut-brain axis involves neurological, immunological, and hormonal mechanisms. Is that something that you can touch upon a little bit more?
Yeah, actually, it was something I was thinking I was going to bring up, so I'm glad
Yeah.
you did. Is that, yeah, there's so many different ways that our gut and our brain talk to each other. And some of it's direct, some of it is indirect, some of it is through the blood system. So the release of hormonal factors in both directions, some of it being proteins and peptides and other things, down that are downstream, such as interleukin 1 beta and interleukin 6 and uh, neurogrowth factors and stuff like that that are bidirectional. So there's definitely the blood component of it, through release. So when you talk about stress, right? Stress, we typically or should typically think of what is that doing to our adrenal glands, where we're constantly putting out low levels of stress hormones, and where's that having an effect? It's not just our brain, but our gut brain as well, and vice versa. I think one of the things that really caught your attention when I pointed out this article to you was, it's buried in the article a little bit. You'd have to dig into the references and such. But I just remember a few years ago, not too many, of reading about research, I think out of University of Maryland. I could be off on that. But where they basically they damaged the gut, like through, as you point out, like antibiotics, and they looked at what the effect was on the brain. And then they reversed it. They damaged the brain and looked at what the effect was on the gut and the microbiome. So it truly is bidirectional. And the part of it is, how do we understand all it? To me, one of the most fascinating, underappreciated ways that our body talks to each other is not just through the hormones and our immune systems and the immune factors and neurotransmitters, but the vagus nerve, to me, is really one of the key components to that. And in case you're not aware, the vagus nerve is one of 12 cranial nerves. They're called cranial nerves because they're not actually embedded in the brain. They kind of come off of the brain stem, kind of like highways in and out of the brain stem. And the vagus nerve is unique. It's not an output one, and it's not a receiving one like your eyes. There's three nerves that control the muscles of your eyes. They look up, down, left, right, so on. They're very efferent. They meaning the signals are going from the brain to the eye muscles, so that when look this way, look that way. Well, the vagus nerve, which touches our baroreceptors, helps influence our blood pressure. It touches our heart, has some influence over our heart, our lungs, and our gut. Vagus means the wanderer in Old Latin. And so, but what's really fascinating about the vagus nerve is it works, it's a very unique nerve in that it works in both directions. It's sending signals from the brain out to these different places, but it's also receiving signals back, from the baroreceptors. How's your blood pressure doing? How's your heart rate doing? Your heart, is talking to your brain. Your lungs are talking to your brain. It's not just one direction. To me, that's one of the most fascinating things.
Hmm. And that really dovetails very well with last episode where we discussed that it was vagus nerve dysfunction caused by an excess viral reservoir in the gut that leads to a downregulation of serotonin in the gut as contributing to some of the main symptoms of long COVID. So,
Well, one of the things reading the articles that we were talking about is, the one I was reading today talks about not, how it influences in that direction, but how the gut is producing serotonin that then influences the vagus nerve in the direction heading north.
right, right. I mean, and of course, there's so many mechanisms that underlie the gut-brain connection, and you touched upon many of them. But just to, when we feed the bacteria in our gut properly, we feed the probiotics with prebiotics. They ferment those and turn them into postbiotics, and these are often short-chain fatty acids that signal to protect the gut lining. They activate various receptors within the gut nervous system. These bacteria can also, they're now termed certain bacteria psychobiotics because, as you pointed out, they produce serotonin, they produce GABA, they produce vitamin B12, etc. And all of that is going to affect the status of both the peripheral and the central nervous system. And also really important is the function of the immune system here, because when we have a healthy microbiome, we have a healthy immune system, we have a healthy populations of T cells, which are essential in the production of both cytokines and antibodies that protect our body against basically anything that is foreign as well as internal. Consider that T cells are also involved with the protection against tumors, for example. So it's really essential that the microbiome and the immune system are coordinating with each other, because what can happen is if we're stressed out, right? You mentioned the cortisol, the adrenal distress. The cortisol rises, it weakens the gut lining, and then you have antigens that leak from the gut lumen into the bloodstream that kind of overactivate the immune system and trigger this low-grade inflammation that then results in a kind of weakness to many other organ systems. So,
Right. And not
yeah,
only they're doing that, but when they're leaking out of the gut, they're also directly interacting with the ends of the vagus nerve,
hmm,
causing signals to be sent up to the vagus nerve as well.
right. So there's a lot to untangle here, but I want to really focus on this traumatic brain injury connection, because you were talking about how the researchers were injuring the gut and that would have an effect on the brain, and then vice versa. Well, it seems like in the instances of brain injury, with traumatic brain injury, that there do appear to be a specific dysbiosis or alteration in the health of the gut microbiome that accompany that brain injury.
Absolutely. And one of the things that, is makes studying concussions, brain injuries, difficult is the lack of a specific kind of a marker to be able to, like, there are some that now on the market, you can draw blood like in the emergency room in the very acute phase, and you can see changes in blood markers. But what I think is a potential is, why aren't we looking at, the microbiome? And, it literally could be as simple, just never simple, but it could be as simple as a stool sample might be a much better way of determining if somebody's had a traumatic brain injury or not. But a lot of these things are transient. And so we know at, say, like day 6 after a head injury, there's definite changes in the gut microbiome. And that may last, up to, say 4 or 5 weeks. We don't know about long term. So somebody that had a concussion 3 years ago and is still struggling with the issues, we don't know if, is that still having an effect on the microbiome. I think it's fascinating, one of those research questions hopefully somebody will pick up and run with.
Well, I think that with humans, of course, it's really complicated to tease apart all of the different influences on the gut microbiome. Because if someone is eating lower quality foods that tend to disrupt the gut microbiome anyway, what is that going to do towards their head injury and vice versa versus someone that eats a perfect, healthy diet rich with, fruits and vegetables, etc. But I
Well,
mean,
and,
from
and
the, yeah.
and something, unfortunately all too common, particularly like in our veterans who are struggling with the after effects of traumatic brain injury is alcohol use and substance abuse. And, that just makes the gut biome even worse. So
Mhm.
it starts to feed on itself in a negative cycle.
Right. From a research perspective, though, the scientists in this article that we're discussing, when they use mice anyway, they're able to control for some of these other variables that might be harder to piece apart in humans. I mean, speaking of potential markers that could be used to identify a traumatic brain injury, scientists indicated that fecal transplant following a traumatic brain injury was able to rescue the levels of certain blood markers of microbial metabolites such as TMAO, that's trimethylamine N oxide. So that might be a potential blood marker that in the future could be used to help establish if treatment is working in traumatic brain injury. It's certainly food for thought.
Absolutely. And so it's one of the biggest reasons, not that in specific, but one of the biggest reasons in general why my go-to way of approaching concussions and brain injuries is nutritionally. All
Mm-hmm.
right. So, I'm looking at not just the long chain omega fatty acids. I'm looking, what's the effect on the B6, B12, vitamin D, and other things. I'm thinking of a patient right now just got blood work back. Somebody that's been, sort of really struggling for several years in a very dependent way. Um, but looking at his blood levels, his hormone levels look great. His thyroid, his testosterone, and so on look great. But like, oh wow, their B6 levels are low, their B12 levels are low, their vitamin D levels are low. We need to jump on that and start addressing it, even in long-term concussion slash brain injury type of patients.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Actually, one question that I wanted to ask you is because, in this article that we're discussing, they're specifically looking at this one research study whereby antibiotics, given concurrently to the mice that they're studying with traumatic brain injury, worsened the physiological and biochemical outcomes associated with brain repair. How often is it for patients with a traumatic brain injury to be in a clinical setting where they're getting antibiotics?
And your typical, so when you look at brain injuries, there's been all kinds of ways to classify it, but now it's pretty much like we're just going to stick with mild, moderate, and severe.
Mhm.
And, concussions would generally, 99% of them would fall under mild. Moderate means there may be a little bit of subdural bleeding, but not severe enough to impact, the potential of being life-threatening. Severe is much obviously, life-threatening. That's what you're thinking about when you think about, a fall from height, car accident, and so on. There's somebody that literally needs acute neurosurgical intervention, life-saving intervention. That's more the severe. So if you're talking about, a concussion, sideline, or what have you, maybe go see urgent care or something that's never not going to be admitted to a hospital into an ICU. Antibiotics would never be appropriately, unless there's some other infection. Antibiotics would never be appropriate. It's more of the acute post-surgical or peri-surgical type of things where you're trying to prevent surgical infections from setting in that you're then using antibiotics. So the worst of the worst head injuries are also being set up for not helping them get better by the use of antibiotics. And you would argue is what's the risk benefit there, and that's something that I don't think anybody's really looked at. Certainly surgical infections are a major issue, and so the risk may be worth it to get the benefit of not having a life-threatening infection on top of the life-threatening head injury.
Right, of course. And it's interesting that in this study, the researchers had found that in the mice that were co-administered the cocktail of broad spectrum antibiotics had worsened neurological repair in the hippocampus, the memory center of the brain. And this was associated with heightened microglial activity. So the typical brain resident immune cell was overactive, likely producing inflammatory factors and disrupting the normal repair of the brain tissue. Interestingly, these researchers had done a lot of immunological studies to characterize what some of the peripheral changes were to the T cells, and they found that there was a downregulation along with the antibiotic administration, that there were less of the reparative T cells that would normally not be present within the central nervous system, but in this case would come in and assist with the repair process. With antibiotics, you just simply had less of that. So in this case, it does very much seem like the immune system was really relying upon a healthy gut microbiome in order to initiate and facilitate those repair responses.
Oh, absolutely. And, I haven't it's been decades since I've been, in an ICU and dealing with this level of trauma. But one thing that's pretty common when you have somebody that's in the level of, had acute neurosurgical intervention at ICU in a coma type of thing, is one of the biggest concerns is always, is the gut working, right? So you're trying to feed them with a nasogastric tube, to be putting food down in there, and we could talk about that too. Sometimes the quality of food, liquid that's being shoved down there is not always the best. Immune enhancing enteral feeds, for a while were like, this is really important. Most hospitals just ignored it because it cost a lot more. But the bigger question is it getting absorbed? And so you've got this head injury, and it's you look back now and you say, well, yeah, it's affecting the gut. And so your gut's not absorbing things. So I just remember back in the day when, when I was in training and stuff, that was a big deal, right? Is the gut actually absorbing anything? And do you need to switch to IV nutrition as a very short interval? It's very expensive. It's very costly in many ways. But if the gut's not working and you got to feed somebody, that can be a big deal, because now we're understanding, as we're talking, right, the brain injury has injured the gut indirectly. So, a lot of things go wrong.
Yeah, I mean, what you said perfectly aligns also with some of the research that I'm reading here, whereby they had shown that you need some of the bacterial metabolites, in particular the short chain fatty acids, to kind of activate the immune system, the peripheral lymphocytes, to regulate the microglia properly so that you don't have this runaway neuroinflammation that is impairing the brain repair. And one of the things that I was thinking about is, does this connect to the omega-3s? Because, of course, in our first episode of this podcast, we were talking about omega-3s and traumatic brain injury. And you gave us many excellent reasons why omega-3s, EPA and DHA, are going to be so healthful in neurological repair and in the nervous system. And then it just dawned on me, wait a minute, there's a gut effect of omega-3s as well. And maybe that is part of this equation too.
Well, yeah, every cell membrane is literally made of fat. And, there are different types of fats. Cholesterol, which gets demonized, is in every cell in our body, but so are omega-6s and so are omega-3s. and probably 100 other fatty acids that make up literally the membrane of every cell. And so when things get damaged and starting to fall apart, is it, you know, you've got to have the repair processes available. My idea of, okay, we've got some damage, a brick wall's been damaged. Let's back up a truck and dump more bricks to make the reconstruction easier. Part of that is what are we putting into the system and where is it repairing? I've always looked at how DHA in particular is helping the brain repair, but the EPA has got a huge influence on our immune system and our heart health and so on. But how much of it we've never really paid that much attention? How much it is really affecting in a positive way the health of the gut?
Right. I recall seeing some studies showing that, in particular, arachidonic acid-rich foods, omega-6 rich foods, your pizzas, etc., are going to be driving some gut dysbiosis in some models. So it's
Well,
interesting.
through
Yeah.
a lot of ways, leaky gut, right?
Yeah.
That loosening of the junctions, so that the the makes the intestinal lumen not as it shouldn't be very permeable, and so omega sixes can sometimes, a lot of times, influence that
Mhm.
permeability in a bad way.
Yeah.
Sorry,
And it,
I interrupted you there.
no, thank you, thank you. I mean, and there might also be other. I mean, leaky gut, of course, is a really important phenomenon, intestinal permeability, and who knows, or perhaps there is some research out there that we can dive into that also demonstrates that there is a direct effect of the fatty acids themselves on the populations of certain probiotic species, maybe in and of themselves. I mean, they're finding every day that nutrients have a prebiotic effect on certain healthful bacteria. When you think about your lactobacilli, your bifidobacterium, but also some of these next generation probiotics, such as Akkermansia muciniphila, is this one probiotic that controls the health and integrity of the mucus lining of the gut barrier. And they're now implicating this Akkermansia bacterium in various neurological disorders. So that might have to be a discussion for another day, but I'm wondering what's Akkermansia doing in traumatic brain injury?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but
Yeah.
I would say, I know we got to wrap up, but I think a good place to sort of wrap this up is, we're talking about probiotics and prebiotics and stuff like that, but what about food?
Mm.
you know? And so where I wanted to just sort of wrap things up is, if you think about it, every major culture has fermented foods as part of their culture. The Korean have kimchi, Germans sauerkraut, and pick a culture, and they've got fermented foods.
Hmm.
And for probably thousands of years, it's been an important part of the human diet. And certainly the American diet doesn't particularly embrace any of that. But why fermented foods? The influence of fermented foods is tremendous on the gut biome in a very good and healthy way. So the more
Right.
we eat fermented foods from whichever culture, whether it's Japanese or Korean or German or name one, that's an important part of our diet that we don't typically think of. We don't think about seafood a whole lot either, but I'd say fermented foods probably are way down the line, way past seafood.
Mm-hmm. So then also, I would love to leave our listeners with our ever-growing list of nutraceuticals and supplements that we could consider for the use in brain health. I mean, when it comes to your patients with traumatic brain injury, of course, we've talked extensively about omega-3s, omega-3 supplementation. But, is there room for a probiotic in this conversation as well?
Well, absolutely. I think there is. It's something that I could do better as a clinician, and digging a little. I talk about eating a healthy diet. So I kind of jump over, is there a problem, and just say, you need to avoid the processed foods and the sugars. It's like throwing gasoline on a fire, of inflammation. So I kind of skip over really assessing the problem. I probably could be a little bit better at assessing, how is their digestion doing after you've had a head injury, and is that a little bit of an issue? And so it's something as a clinician I know I need to do better.
Well, no judgment here. I mean, I enjoy our conversations each time. Your wealth of knowledge. So thank you so much for your time today. And I guess on my end, I'm going to keep taking my omega-3s and my probiotics, and hope that I don't get hit by a car while biking or something like that. A little bit morbid joke, but I guess that's what happens on a Wednesday night. So
Yep.
yeah.
All right, Miles. Always been fun.
Dr. Lewis,
Can't
thank
wait
you
for the
very
next
much.
one.
Yes, I can't wait for the next one. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. Take care, be well, and until next time.